Hello and welcome to another video. This is Lila McGuire.
Yes, it's Lila today. My sweet girl Lila, who is age
10.
And why are you joining me today?
Because we made these cards together.
Yes, we did. And these cards feature one of your favorite things in the whole world.
Dogs.
Yes, we love dogs. So we did a bunch of dog cards, and Lila and I wanted to share them with you. Anything else you want to say?
I hope you enjoy.
Good. All right, let's get started. Now, these cards feature using small die cuts repeatedly on a background and how to step that up by using scraps and adding stamping, using pattern paper, and so on. Now, Lila's not sticking around for the voiceover because she has a friend over, so I'll be sharing with you what we created, and you'll see her hands in action throughout. We're using the Newton's Nook dog silhouette dies. Now, we're using these because Lila's a fan of dogs and had a dog birthday party, so we had dog thank you cards to make, and we kind of got carried away. But if you are a cat person, you could instead get the Newton Nook's cat silhouette die set, or you can put them together if you wanted. We started by doing a lot of die cutting from scraps I had saved over time. You can see them all divided in Ziploc bags that I can reuse. Now, first we have white die cuts. We have a lot of these. These were cut from those bits of white scrap that I had left over where there was just enough room to die cut something small. If you don't have cardstock scraps like that, you could also get an inexpensive white cardstock. These will serve as a base for our colored dogs. I also asked Lila to go through my color scrap drawers and grab the smallest scraps because we don't need big scraps for these small die cuts. She chose a bunch that I cut from some rainbow colors of cardstock and put that in one bag. And in another bag, we put some pinks and greens and pool colors together. And then in another bag, we have a bunch of pattern paper die cut dogs. Now, here's the thing with pattern papers. I think a lot of us like to buy them, but don't use them often. And Lila loves using pattern paper on her cards. So we're going to be doing that today. We went for the Sunny Studio 6x6 pattern paper pads. Those are our favorites because they often have tone-on-tone colors, and on the other side, something a little more bright and colorful. We'll be using the tone-on-tone colors today on our dogs. Let's get started with the pattern paper, then we'll come to the colored cardstock die cuts, and I'll show you how to step that up. Stay tuned because that technique is really fun and easy. But here, we're just stacking some die cuts together. We have 2 white die cuts and 1 pattern paper die cut, and we're gluing those together for dimension. You could totally skip the dimension if you want to, but Lila and I like to put on a Reds game and sit and watch while we glue these together in front of the TV, and then later take them to our craft desk where we can assemble the cards. So here's proof that we like to do that. Look at all of these stacked die cuts. 2 die cuts of white cardstock, and then 1 pattern paper on top. And we have all of these ready to go to make a bunch of cards. You'll see her do some of this gluing here in a moment. All right, now along with this, we use the Trinity Stamps Puppy Party stamp set and coordinating dies. Lila fell in love with the set, and there's a sentiment in here that says you're positively amazing, and we'll be using that for all of our cards. That would also work for the cat cards too, if you were to make that version. Now off screen, I did a bunch of heat embossing. I did this part. She could have done stamping of black ink on white, but we liked the look of white heat embossing on black cardstock. So I heat embossed a bunch of those, then used the coordinating die to cut it out. Then I glued 2 white die cuts once again behind that, so it'll have that dimension. So now we have a bunch of sentiments ready to go also. Believe it or not, this is the way we craft a lot for fun. I just don't often show this in videos. Now that we have all of these pieces ready, it's time for us to create these backgrounds. We're starting with a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch top folding white note card, and Lila is demonstrating gluing the die cuts in place. We usually like to start with the sentiment first and choose its position, and then place all the dogs around it. Now Lila, what kind of glue are you using here?
We're using Miss Gina's glue.
Miss Gina's glue. So this is the Gina K Connect liquid adhesive. We take it out of the large bottle, which she now has available, and we put it in this fine tip bottle, and it is easy to use, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, when you're crafting, what do I often say to you?
You usually tell me to use just a little bit of glue because I always use a lot.
You like to use a lot of glue. Well, you're used to glue sticks at school, which don't work unless you use a lot, right?
Yeah.
So this, a little goes a long way.
Yep.
So Lila will show you up close how much she puts on it. I usually put a little bit less, but it's totally up to you. This will hold very well. Now, creating a background of repeated die cuts, especially small ones like this, is easy to do if you start in one spot and work your way around it to fill the card. So we're starting with the sentiment in the middle top there, and then we're placing dogs around that, trying to get them close to each other but not touching. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's kind of fun to do, kind of like putting a puzzle together. Once we've put die cuts around the sentiment, we'll work our way out, filling out from there. This way you don't get any like trapped, awkward spaces that are hard to fill. So we'll continue to glue these die cuts over the entire background, making sure that lots of it hangs off the edge. That just gives a more complete background look. Once we're done and give it some time to dry, we can flip it over and use scissors to cut off the excess. Lila will show you that I keep all of these little dog rears and heads and tails and feet that we cut off so that we can use them in small spaces on other cards up along the edge. So be sure to keep all of those pieces. So here is one of the completed cards that Lila did. We picked a matching envelope, which is a great way to finish it off. And I'll show you a bunch more, but first let's do the technique of stamping on these small die cuts. This is very easy to do and something that both Lila and I liked to do to kind of add a little interest to these die cuts, especially if you're using solid cardstock. I am once again gluing 2 dogs together cut from white and then a colored one on top. Last time we used pattern paper. This time we're just using those scraps of cardstock that needed to be used. And I will again do a bunch of these and have them ready to go. You can skip that dimension if you want. Now I have a note card here and I'm putting some temporary tape on the back of our sentiment. I'm just putting it there as a placeholder right now. And then we will glue those die cuts, those stacked die cuts around that sentiment. So this is the same process that you just saw Lila do, but this time I have my sentiment towards the bottom. Most of our cards today show covering the background with lots of these small die cuts. These die cuts could be any shape. I thought the animals were fun, but you could do hearts, stars, flowers, whatever you have. Look at your die sets or your coordinating die sets. A lot of time there are smaller dies included that often get overlooked, and they're great for this technique. So now here I have glued a bunch down, but I'm going to go ahead and stop and trim off the excess. So I can take one of those small pieces and glue that in one of my open areas along the edge. This way I can be sure to use all the bits and pieces and make the most out of all of my scraps. So here we have the rear end of this dog. I'm just going to glue him to this little space over here, let that dry, and then we can trim it once again. Once I've covered the entire card, I can flip it over to cut off the excess. I like to use long blade scissors for this. My favorite are from Tim Holtz. I'll link to them below. They're super strong, cut really well. The version I have doesn't have the serrated edge, so it cuts nice and smooth. I also like to use a paper sander just to smooth any of those sharp edges that those stacked die cuts may have. It really makes a big difference in getting smooth edges. And here you can see I still have a few little extra spots, so I'll take those leftover dog parts and glue them in here and there to fill it completely. If you want to save time, you could instead just do a border of small die cuts or cover maybe half the card. I just like covering the entire thing. Now it's time to add stamping to our die cuts. Yes, we've already glued them down, but we can still stamp on them. And I have several variations of this to share with you. This is an excellent time to use your background stamps. I'm using my MISTI stamping tool, but you can skip using it if you prefer. And I also have a sticky mat from Brutus Monroe that will hold our card in place as we stamp on it. But you could use temporary tape or temporary adhesive to hold it in place if you prefer. I have a background stamp. This one is from Simon Says Stamp. I love their text background stamps. The detail on this stamp is perfect for this technique. So I have my stamp in the MISTI stamping tool. I'm laying my card face down straight on it, closing the MISTI upside down, and the sticky mat will grab that card and hold it in place. And that way I know when I stamp on it, it'll be stamped straight. I chose to stamp this with Hero Art's Granite ink, which is the perfect gray color. I chose gray ink because I thought that would look good on all the different colors of cardstock here. You could also use VersaMark for a more subtle look. Now what happens is when I stamp this, the ink will land on those colored die cuts because we put that added dimension behind them. The ink will not hit that white cardstock, so the stamping is only on those die cuts. And the stamping is continuous. You can see the text continues across all of the dogs because we stamped on it after we glued the dogs down. I did remove the sentiment to do the stamping, and I'll just put it back in place. And there we have some colored cardstock scraps turned into a colorful background with stamping added. Now let's do a few other versions of this using some other background stamps. Then I'll demonstrate in white ink. This is the Inkblot Shop Slim Stripes background stamp. I really like Inkblot Shop's background stamps because they're clear, so they're really easy to use and you can get the placement just right. Here I'm stamping once again with the gray ink right on top of all of our colored dogs. I really like this version because we end up with these stripes that are continuous across the card instead of each dog having stripes in different directions. It gives a really fun, completed look to your card in the end. And this can be done with any background stamps. I do recommend background stamps that have a smaller pattern so that you're able to see it repeat on the dogs. All right, so now it's time for another example. This is also from Inkblot Shop. This is the Starry Sprinkle stamp. This has a bunch of stars that are spaced a little bit farther apart. So what I'll do is I'll stamp it once in one direction, pick up the card, rotate it, and stamp it again. That way I get some of these stars kind of overlapping, and we add more stamping to our dogs. So for these cards so far, I've been using the gray ink, so we could get kind of a tone-on-tone look. This time, let's use white ink. So I have another one of my cards I'm placing onto the soft plaid background stamp from Simon Says Stamp. This stamp is great for this technique also. This time, I'm inking up the stamp with white pigment ink. And that way my stamping will be white on top of the colored die cuts. And I really like how this one turned out also. I will repeat this a couple times just to make sure the white is really vibrant on those dog die cuts. By the way, if you choose to not add dimension behind the dogs, I would stamp with white pigment ink. That way the white pigment ink will show up on the colored die cuts and blend into the white background. But because we have dimension behind my die cuts, the ink never actually reaches the background. Before we show you a bunch of the cards we made, I did add some sequins to some of my cards and some of those open spaces. This is helpful if you want to make your die cuts spaced out more, so you use less of them, and then you can fill in the areas with little sequins or gems. I really like these from Trinity stamps because they're flat and there are a few different sizes included, and they pick up whatever colors are around them. I again use the Gina K Connect liquid adhesive to apply these, and I use that pickup stick so I can pick up the sequin and put it exactly where I want it. I didn't end up adding those to most of the cards, but it is a fun option. So now Lila's going to show you a bunch of the cards that we made. This was her first one, and you can see we skipped the sequins on it, and it really has a lot of interest thanks to those Sunny Studios pattern papers that we used. Here I'm showing her how to tilt it in the camera so you can see all of the dimension. Now here is a version where we did add those sequins, and you can see how nicely it catches the light. Lila did pick a matching envelope for each of the cards. I really feel like when you put a lot of time into your card, it's nice to put it in a matching envelope. And I'll link to some of my favorite sources below. Watch this, she gives a little thumbs up. All right, next up we have another pattern paper one. This is just the plaid pattern papers from Sunny Studio. This I think is a definite favorite of mine. It would be great for a baby card. Now look here, here are a bunch of cards we've made so far. We still have a lot of dog die cuts, especially the pattern paper ones left. So we'll be making those off screen for the next couple weeks. Here is the solid colored die cuts where we stamped the stars with gray ink. And then we have the stripes that we stamped with gray. I think this was one that we really liked and plan to do more of. Notice how the gray dries to kind of give a tone-on-tone look on most of those die cuts, but you could use white ink if you prefer. Now here is the one where we stamp the text, and notice that text is continuous across all of the die cuts. And finally, we have the plaid that we stamped with white pigment ink. Now here we have tried out 4 different stamps, and we'll choose our favorites and make more using those off screen. Also, Lila did make some other versions by gluing the die cuts in different arrangements. On some she did little borders, on some she added hearts. It's fun once you have all your die cuts made, stacked and ready to go, how many cards you can crank out pretty quickly, and it's really fun to do. Well, I hope you enjoyed these cards that we made together. I think it's a fun way to use your small die cuts creatively, so look through your stash and see what you have. If you're interested in what I used, it's linked below in my YouTube description. And thank you to Lila for joining me today. Hopefully she'll join in another video soon. If you also want other ideas for using small die cuts, I have a couple other videos here. Thanks for watching. See you soon.